Lady Beatrice Ashford had spent her entire life perfecting the art of being overlooked. In the glittering salons of Regency London, where young women were expected to play simple melodies and blush at compliments, she had learned to hide her true talent behind a veil of mediocrity. But when the arrogant Duke of Winterbourne mocked her musical preferences at Lady Pemberton's soirée, dismissing her as yet another simpering debutante with pedestrian taste, Beatrice made a decision that would shatter his world. What he didn't know was that the lost sonata he'd been searching for across Europe, the one composition that had eluded even the most accomplished musicians, had been in her possession all along, and she was the only person alive who could play it. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you're listening to this story. I want to know how far it has traveled. The spring of 1815 brought with it a season of unprecedented splendor to London society, and nowhere was this more evident than in the Ashford townhouse on Berkeley Square. Lady Beatrice Ashford stood before the tall windows of the music room, her fingers absently tracing the ivory keys of the pianoforte as she watched carriages roll past in the street below. At 22, she possessed a delicate beauty that turned heads. Dark, auburn hair that caught the light like burnished copper, intelligent hazel eyes that observed far more than they revealed, and a graceful bearing that spoke of her family's ancient lineage. Yet for all her advantages, Beatrice felt like a bird in a gilded cage, her wings clipped by the very society that claimed to celebrate her. Her father, the Earl of Ashford, had made his intentions clear from the moment she turned 18. She was to marry well, to secure an alliance that would benefit the family's standing and fortunes. For 4 seasons, she had dutifully attended balls and soirees, smiled at appropriate suitors, and played the role expected of her. But this season was different. This season her father had made arrangements with the Duke of Winterbourne, a man whose wealth and title were matched only by his reputation for cold calculation and intellectual superiority. Beatrice had met Alexander Thorne, the Duke of Winterbourne, only twice before their engagement was announced. He was handsome in a severe way, with dark hair silvered at the temples, despite his 35 years, piercing blue eyes that seemed to assess and dismiss in equal measure, and a bearing that commanded immediate attention. He came from one of England's oldest ducal families, his lineage traceable to the Norman conquest, and he carried that heritage like armor. Their first meeting had been at a dinner party, where he'd spoken at length about his travels through the continent, his collection of rare manuscripts, and his patronage of the arts. He had barely looked at her, addressing his comments to her father as though she were merely another acquisition to be catalogued and stored. Their second meeting had been more intimate, a private tea in the Ashford drawing-room, where the terms of their arrangement were delicately discussed. The Duke had been polite but distant, inquiring about her education, her accomplishments, her health. When she'd mentioned her love of music, he had smiled indulgently, the way one might smile at a child's simple pleasure. "How charming," he'd said. "My mother was fond of the pianoforte as well. Simple melodies can be quite soothing to the feminine temperament." Beatrice had bitten her tongue, swallowing the retort that threatened to escape. She wanted to tell him that she didn't play simple melodies, that she had spent years studying the most complex compositions of Mozart, Beethoven, and Haydn, that she had even begun composing her own pieces in secret. But she had learned long ago that such declarations only invited condescension or disbelief. Women were expected to be accomplished, yes, but not too accomplished. They were to entertain, not to excel. Now, as she stood in her music room on this bright April morning, Beatrice contemplated the life that stretched before her. In 3 weeks, she would become the Duchess of Winterbourne. She would preside over his vast estates, manage his household, bear his children, and attend endless social functions where she would be admired for her beauty and her connections, but never for her mind. The Duke had made it clear that he expected a wife who would enhance his reputation, not challenge it. He wanted an ornament, not a partner. Her daily life had already begun to shift in anticipation of the wedding. Her mornings were consumed with fittings for her trousseau, meetings with the wedding planner, and lessons from her mother on the duties of a duchess. Lady Ashford, a woman who had long ago resigned herself to the limitations of her own marriage, seemed determined to ensure that Beatrice understood the importance of compliance. "A wife's happiness lies in her husband's satisfaction," she would say, adjusting the fall of lace on yet another gown. "Your father and the Duke have made an excellent match. You should be grateful." Grateful. The word echoed in Beatrice's mind as she finally sat down at the pianoforte and began to play. Her fingers moved across the keys with practiced precision, finding solace in the music that had always been her refuge. She played a Beethoven sonata, one of the later works that few attempted due to its technical demands and emotional complexity. The music filled the room, passionate and defiant, expressing everything she could not say aloud. She didn't hear the door open behind her, didn't notice her younger sister Cecilia slip into the room, until the final notes faded into silence. Cecilia, just 18 and preparing for her own debut, possessed a sunny disposition that seemed untouched by the cynicism that had begun to colour Beatrice's view of their world. "That was beautiful," Cecilia said softly, settling onto the window seat. "Though I don't know how you can play something so melancholy when you're about to become a duchess." Beatrice turned to face her sister, managing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Perhaps that's precisely why I play it." Cecilia's expression grew troubled. "You don't love him, do you? The Duke?" "Love?" Beatrice laughed, but there was no humour in the sound. "Love is a luxury for those who can afford it, Cece. I have a duty to our family, and the Duke is an advantageous match. That's all that matters. But surely you could find someone who what? Who sees me as more than a pretty face and a respectable bloodline? Who values my mind as much as my dowry?" Beatrice shook her head. "Such men don't exist in our world, dear sister. Or if they do, they're not dukes with the power to secure our family's future." The truth was more complicated than Beatrice could explain even to Cecilia. The Ashford family, for all their ancient title and impressive townhouse, were facing financial difficulties that her father had managed to keep hidden from society. Poor investments and mounting debts had left them in a precarious position. The Duke of Winterbourne's interest in Beatrice had been a godsend to her father. The marriage settlement would restore the family's fortunes and ensure Cecilia's own prospects remained bright. Beatrice understood this, accepted it even, but understanding didn't make the cage feel any less confining. That evening, Beatrice attended a musical at Lady Pemberton's residence, one of the last social events before the wedding preparations would consume her entirely. The drawing room was filled with London's elite, all gathered to hear a celebrated Italian soprano who had recently arrived in the city. Beatrice sat near the back, content to observe rather than be observed, when she felt a presence beside her. "Lady Beatrice," the Duke of Winterbourne said, his voice carrying that note of polite indifference she had come to recognize. "I didn't expect to see you here this evening. I thought you'd be occupied with wedding preparations." "Even brides-to-be need occasional respite, Your Grace," she replied, keeping her tone light and pleasant. He settled into the chair beside her, his attention already drifting toward the front of the room where the soprano was preparing to perform. "Indeed. Though I confess I'm surprised you chose a musical evening. I wouldn't have thought such sophisticated entertainment would appeal to you." Beatrice felt a flicker of irritation, but maintained her composure. "I enjoy music, Your Grace. You know this. Yes, of course, simple pleasures and all that." He waved a dismissive hand. "But this is rather different from the parlour pieces young ladies typically favour. Madame Rossellini will be performing arias from the Italian masters. Quite complex, really. Requires a certain level of musical education to fully appreciate." Before Beatrice could respond, the performance began, and she was forced to sit in silence beside the man who would soon be her husband, the man who had just casually dismissed her intelligence and taste as inadequate. As the soprano's voice soared through the room, Beatrice made a decision. She had spent years hiding her true abilities, years pretending to be less than she was to make others comfortable. But perhaps, just perhaps, it was time to stop pretending. As the evening drew to a close and guests began to depart, Beatrice felt the weight of her approaching wedding day settle more heavily upon her shoulders. In 3 weeks, she would walk down the aisle of St. George's Church and become the Duchess of Winterbourne. In 3 weeks, the golden cage would lock forever. The thought filled her with a growing sense of unease that she couldn't quite shake, a whisper of rebellion that grew louder with each passing day. The night of the pre-wedding ball arrived with all the grandeur that London society could muster. The Duke of Winterbourne had spared no expense in hosting the event at his magnificent residence on Grosvenor Square, a palatial mansion that spoke of centuries of wealth and power. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across marble floors, while hundreds of candles illuminated rooms filled with the cream of English aristocracy. Beatrice arrived with her family, a gown of ivory silk and Brussels lace, a masterpiece of the modiste's art, her auburn hair arranged in an elaborate coiffure adorned with pearls. She looked every inch the future Duchess, and the assembled guests murmured their approval as she entered on her father's arm. The evening began with all the ceremony expected of such an occasion. The Duke stood at the entrance to the ballroom, receiving guests with his characteristic cool courtesy. When Beatrice approached, he took her hand and raised it to his lips in a gesture that was technically correct, but utterly devoid of warmth. "You look well, Lady Beatrice," he said, his eyes already moving past her to greet the next arrival. "The ivory becomes you." Beatrice smiled and murmured her thanks, taking her place beside him as they welcomed the seemingly endless stream of guests. Lords and ladies, politicians and poets, musicians and merchants, all of London's elite had turned out to celebrate the union of two prominent families. Yet as the evening progressed, Beatrice couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The Duke seemed distracted, his attention frequently drawn to a particular corner of the ballroom where her younger sister Cecilia stood in conversation with several young people. When the receiving line finally ended and the dancing began, the Duke led Beatrice onto the floor for the first waltz. They moved through the steps with practiced precision, but there was no connection between them, no spark of genuine feeling. "You've done well tonight," he said as they turned. "You'll make an adequate duchess." Adequate. The word stung more than it should have, but Beatrice maintained her composure. "I shall endeavour to exceed adequacy, Your Grace." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Ambition is unbecoming in a woman, Lady Beatrice. I prefer contentment to striving." Before she could respond, the waltz ended, and the Duke escorted her back to where her mother stood. "If you'll excuse me," he said with a slight bow, "there are several matters requiring my attention." Beatrice watched him cross the ballroom, her unease growing as he made his way directly to where Cecilia stood. Her sister, radiant in a gown of pale pink, was laughing at something one of her companions had said. The Duke approached, spoke briefly to the group, and then offered his arm to Cecilia. Beatrice felt her heart begin to pound as she watched her sister hesitate, glance in her direction with an expression of confusion, and then accept the Duke's escort. Lady Ashford touched Beatrice's arm. "I'm sure it's nothing, dear. He's simply being polite to your sister." But it wasn't nothing. Beatrice could see that in the way the Duke bent his head towards Cecilia as they walked, in the way her sister's cheeks flushed pink, in the way they disappeared through the French doors leading to the terrace, the ballroom suddenly felt too hot, too crowded, too bright. Beatrice excused herself from her mother and made her way through the throng of guests, following the path the Duke and Cecilia had taken. The terrace was lit by torches that cast dancing shadows across the stone balustrade. At first, Beatrice saw no one, and she felt a moment of relief. Perhaps she had been mistaken. Perhaps her imagination had run away with her. But then she heard voices from the garden below, and she moved to the edge of the terrace, looking down into the shadowed paths. There, beneath an arbour of climbing roses, stood the Duke of Winterbourne and Cecilia. And as Beatrice watched in growing horror, the Duke took her sister's hands in his and spoke words that carried clearly in the still night air. "Miss Cecilia, I must speak plainly. I have made a terrible mistake. When I agreed to marry your sister, I had not yet met you. But from the moment I saw you at that dinner party 3 weeks ago, I knew that I had chosen the wrong sister." Cecilia tried to pull her hands away, her voice trembling. "Your Grace, you mustn't say such things. You're engaged to Beatrice. The wedding is in a fortnight. An engagement that can be broken," the Duke insisted. "Cecilia, may I call you Cecilia? You are everything I could want in a wife, young, unspoiled, with a sweetness of temperament that your sister lacks. Beatrice is handsome enough, I suppose, but she has a sharpness about her, an independence of mind that I find unsettling. You, on the other hand, are perfectly suited to be a duchess." Beatrice gripped the stone balustrade so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She should leave, should turn away before she heard more. But she was frozen in place, unable to move as her world crumbled around her. Cecilia was shaking her head, tears visible on her cheeks, even from this distance. "I cannot, I will not, betray my sister in this way. She is good and kind, and she deserves better than this cruelty." "Does she?" The Duke's voice took on a harder edge. "Tell me, Cecilia, has your sister ever truly wanted this marriage? Has she ever looked at me with anything other than dutiful resignation? I think not. In fact, I believe she will be relieved to be released from an obligation she never desired." "That doesn't make this right," Cecilia said, but her voice was weakening. "What is right," the Duke said firmly, "is that I marry the woman I actually wish to marry. Your father will understand. The marriage settlement can be adjusted. And Beatrice, well, Beatrice will have her freedom, won't she? Isn't that what she truly wants?" Beatrice didn't wait to hear more. She turned and fled back into the ballroom, her mind reeling. The noise and light that had seemed overwhelming before now felt distant, as though she were moving through water. She needed to leave, needed to escape, before the humiliation became public, before everyone in London society witnessed her disgrace. But it was already too late. As she pushed through the crowd, searching for her father, she heard the whispers beginning. Heads turned, fans fluttered, and behind gloved hands the gossip spread like wildfire. Someone had seen the Duke and Cecilia in the garden. Someone had heard their conversation. And now, in the space of mere minutes, everyone knew that the Duke of Winterbourne was jilting his bride-to-be in favour of her younger sister. Beatrice finally found her father in the card-room, deep in conversation with several other gentlemen. When she appeared in the doorway, pale and trembling, he took one look at her face and rose immediately. "Beatrice, what's happened?" She couldn't speak, couldn't find the words to explain the catastrophe that had just unfolded. But she didn't need to. The Duke of Winterbourne appeared behind her, Cecilia at his side, and the expression on his face was one of cold determination. "Lord Ashford," the Duke said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room, "I must speak with you privately. There has been a change in circumstances regarding the wedding." The Earl's face went from confusion to fury as understanding dawned. "A change in circumstances? What manner of change could possibly—" He stopped, his gaze moving from the Duke to Cecilia, who stood with tears streaming down her face, and then to Beatrice, who stood frozen in the doorway. "No, you cannot mean— I mean that I have made an error in judgment," the Duke said calmly, as though he were discussing nothing more significant than a change in dinner plans. "Lady Beatrice is a fine woman, but I have come to realize that her sister is better suited to be my duchess. I am prepared to make the necessary adjustments to the marriage settlement to reflect this change." The room erupted. Several gentlemen rose from their chairs, voices raised in protest and shock. Lady Ashford appeared, having followed the commotion, and immediately grasped what had occurred. She swayed on her feet, and Beatrice moved instinctively to support her mother, even as her own world shattered around her. "This is unconscionable," Lord Ashford said, his voice shaking with rage. "You have humiliated my daughter in front of all of London society. The wedding invitations have been sent, the settlements signed, the can be unsigned, the Duke interrupted. I am within my rights to withdraw from the engagement, and I believe, if you are honest, you will admit that Lady Beatrice herself has never been enthusiastic about this match. I am offering her freedom, Lord Ashford, and offering your family an even better alliance through marriage to your younger daughter. Beatrice finally found her voice. And what of what Cecilia wants? Or does her opinion matter as little as mine has? The Duke turned to her, and for the first time that evening he looked directly at her. Your sister will learn to be content, as all wives must. But unlike you, Lady Beatrice, she has the temperament for contentment. You, I think, would have made us both miserable. The truth of his words cut deeper than any insult could have. He was right. She had never wanted this marriage, had been walking toward it like a prisoner toward the gallows, but to be cast aside so publicly, to be rejected in favor of her own sister, to have her inadequacies announced before all of society, it was a humiliation beyond bearing. I see, Beatrice said quietly, her voice steady despite the chaos raging inside her. Then I release you from our engagement, Your Grace. May you and my sister find the happiness you seek. She turned and walked from the room, her head held high, her spine straight, even as she felt the eyes of London's elite boring into her back. She heard her mother's sob, her father's continued protests, Cecilia's tearful apologies, but she didn't stop. She walked through the ballroom, past the whispering guests, past the musicians who had fallen silent, past the servants who averted their eyes. She walked out of the Duke of Winterbourne's magnificent mansion and into the night, where her family's carriage waited. Only when she was safely inside, hidden behind the curtained windows, did Beatrice allow herself to break. The tears came in great, gasping sobs, tears of humiliation and rage and grief for the life she had resigned herself to, and the freedom she had gained at such a terrible cost. She had been found wanting, judged inadequate, and cast aside like a gown that no longer pleased. And all of London would know it by morning. As the carriage rolled through the dark streets toward Berkeley Square, Beatrice made a vow. She would never again allow herself to be diminished, never again pretend to be less than she was to satisfy someone else's expectations. The Duke of Winterbourne had given her freedom, though not in the way he had intended. And she would use that freedom to become the woman she had always been meant to be, even if society would never forgive her for it. The scandal broke across London society like a summer storm, swift and devastating. By the morning after the disastrous ball, every drawing room in Mayfair buzzed with the tale of Lady Beatrice Ashford's public humiliation. The details grew more lurid with each retelling. Some claimed she had been caught in a compromising position with another man. Others whispered that she had been barren and the Duke had discovered it. Still others suggested she had gone mad and attacked her sister in a jealous rage. None of these stories were true, but truth mattered little when scandal provided such delicious entertainment. Beatrice spent 3 days locked in her room at the Berkeley Square townhouse, refusing visitors and meals alike. Her mother wept in the drawing room. Her father raged in his study, and Cecilia hovered outside her door, begging for forgiveness that Beatrice was not yet ready to give. On the 4th day, a letter arrived that would change everything. It was from her father's sister, Lady Agatha Thornbury, a widow who had scandalized society years ago by refusing to remarry after her husband's death, and instead dedicating herself to intellectual pursuits. Aunt Agatha lived in Bath, where she hosted a salon frequented by writers, musicians, scientists, and other individuals whom polite society considered dangerously radical. Beatrice had always admired her aunt from afar. Though they had rarely been allowed to spend time together, Lady Ashford considered her sister-in-law's influence corrupting. The letter was brief and to the point. "My dear Beatrice, I have heard of your recent troubles. London is no place for you now. The vultures will pick at your bones until there is nothing left. Come to Bath. Stay with me for as long as you need. I promise you sanctuary, and perhaps something more valuable: perspective. Your affectionate aunt, Agatha." Beatrice read the letter 3 times. each time feeling a small spark of hope kindle in her chest. Bath, a city known for its healing waters and its slightly more relaxed social atmosphere. A place where she might breathe again, away from the suffocating judgment of London society. Her father initially refused to allow it. Running away will only make you look guilty, he argued. You must stay and face down the gossip, show society that you have nothing to be ashamed of. But Beatrice was done with performing for society's benefit. I have nothing to be ashamed of, she agreed. But neither do I have any desire to remain here and be subjected to their cruelty. I'm going to Bath, father, with or without your permission. Perhaps it was the steel in her voice, or perhaps he simply wanted her gone so that he could focus on salvaging Cecilia's prospects. But Lord Ashford relented. Within a week, Beatrice found herself on a coach bound for Bath, a lady's maid beside her, and a trunk full of belongings secured on top. As London's spires faded behind them, Beatrice felt the tight band around her chest begin to loosen. She was leaving behind everything she had known, but she was also leaving behind the cage that had confined her. Aunt Agatha's residence in Bath was a gracious townhouse on the Royal Crescent, with views over the city and the surrounding countryside. The moment Beatrice stepped through the door, she was enveloped in an embrace that smelled of lavender and old books. "My poor dear girl," Agatha said, pulling back to study her niece's face. At 53, Lady Agatha Thornbury was a handsome woman with silver-streaked dark hair, keen grey eyes, and a manner that brooked no nonsense. She wore a simple day dress of deep blue, unadorned by the excessive ruffles and ribbons that fashion dictated, and her only jewellery was a cameo brooch at her throat. "You look exhausted. Come, let's get you settled, and then we shall have tea and talk." Over tea in Agatha's comfortable sitting room, Beatrice found herself telling the whole story, not just the events of the disastrous ball, but everything that had led up to it. Her years of hiding her true abilities, her resignation to a loveless marriage, her growing sense of suffocation. Agatha listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly thoughtful. When Beatrice finally fell silent, Agatha set down her teacup with a decisive click. "Well," she said, "it seems to me that the Duke of Winterbourne has done you an enormous favour, though I doubt he intended it that way." Beatrice looked up in surprise. "A favour? Aunt, he humiliated me before all of London." "He freed you," Agatha corrected. "Oh, I know it doesn't feel that way now. The humiliation is real and I don't minimize it. But consider what your life would have been as his Duchess. You would have spent decades pretending to be someone you're not, stifling your intelligence and your passion to satisfy his ego. Now, you have a chance to discover who you truly are and what you're truly capable of." "But what use is that when I'm ruined in society's eyes?" Beatrice asked bitterly. "No respectable man will have me now. I'll end up a spinster, dependent on my father's charity." "And would that be so terrible?" Agatha asked. "I am a widow who refused to remarry, and I assure you my life has been far richer and more fulfilling than it ever was when I was trying to be the perfect society wife. There are other ways to live, Beatrice, other paths than the one society has laid out for you, but you must be brave enough to walk them." Over the following weeks, Beatrice began to discover what her aunt meant. Agatha's salon met twice weekly, and Beatrice found herself thrust into a world she had never known existed. Here were women who wrote novels under their own names, men who debated philosophy and politics with passion, musicians who played not for polite applause, but for the pure love of their art. Here, for the first time in her life, Beatrice was encouraged to speak her mind, to share her opinions, to be fully herself. At first, she held back, years of training making her cautious. But gradually, as she realized that these people valued intelligence and authenticity over propriety and pretense, she began to open up. She spoke about music, about the compositions she had studied, about her own tentative attempts at composing. She debated literature with a female novelist who had just published a controversial work on women's education. She discussed science with a gentleman who was studying the new field of geology. It was at one of these salon evenings, about 6 weeks after her arrival in Bath, that Beatrice met Dr. Elias Reed. He arrived late, apologizing for his tardiness with a warm smile that transformed his rather serious face. Dr. Reed was perhaps 30 years old, tall and lean, with light brown hair that refused to stay properly combed and grey eyes that held both intelligence and kindness. He was a physician, Agatha explained, who had recently returned from several years studying medicine in Edinburgh and on the continent. Dr. Reed has been telling me about the most fascinating developments in medical treatment, Agatha said, drawing him into their circle. Elias, this is my niece, Lady Beatrice Ashford. Beatrice, Dr. Elias Reed. Dr. Reed bowed, but there was nothing of the Duke's cold formality in the gesture. Lady Beatrice, I'm delighted to meet you. Your aunt speaks of you often, and with great affection. Does she? Beatrice found herself smiling despite her usual reserve with strangers. I hope she hasn't bored you with tales of her wayward niece. On the contrary, I found her accounts of your musical talent quite intriguing. Lady Agatha mentioned that you've been studying some of the more complex classical compositions. That requires considerable dedication and skill. Beatrice felt a flutter of surprise. He had actually listened to what Agatha had said about her, had registered her accomplishments, rather than dismissing them as mere feminine accomplishments. I've always loved music, she said carefully, though I fear my talent is modest compared to true masters. False modesty is unnecessary here, Agatha interjected. Beatrice plays beautifully, Elias, though she's been taught to hide it. Perhaps you could convince her to perform for us one evening. I would be honored to hear you play, Dr. Reed said, and there was genuine interest in his voice. Though I confess my own musical education is sadly lacking. I can appreciate beauty when I hear it, but I haven't the knowledge to understand the technical complexities. They talked for nearly an hour, and Beatrice found herself relaxing in his company in a way she rarely did with men. Dr. Reed asked questions that suggested real curiosity about her thoughts and opinions. When she mentioned that she had been reading about the new theories of musical harmony, he didn't dismiss her interest as inappropriate for a woman, but instead asked her to explain what she had learned. When she spoke about her love of Beethoven's later works, he didn't condescend, but admitted his own ignorance, and asked her to recommend pieces he should seek out. As the evening drew to a close and guests began to depart, Dr. Reed approached Beatrice once more. Lady Beatrice, I wonder if I might ask a favor. I've been invited to a concert next week. A visiting pianist from Vienna will be performing. I had planned to attend alone, but I think the experience would be far more enriching if I had someone knowledgeable to help me understand what I'm hearing. Would you consider accompanying me? Your aunt would be welcome as well, of course. Beatrice hesitated, old habits of caution rising up. But then she remembered Agatha's words about being brave enough to walk new paths. I would enjoy that, Dr. Reed. Thank you for the invitation. His smile was genuine and warm. Excellent. I shall call for you both next Tuesday at 7. After he had gone, Agatha came to stand beside Beatrice at the window, watching the guests depart into the summer evening. Elias is a good man, she said quietly. He came to Bath after his own disappointment, a broken engagement to a woman who decided she preferred a wealthier suitor. He understands something of what you've experienced. He seems kind, Beatrice admitted, and he actually listened when I spoke about music. He didn't dismiss my interest as trivial. That's because he's intelligent enough to recognize intelligence in others, regardless of their sex, Agatha said. There are such men in the world, Beatrice, though they're rarer than they should be, and they're worth knowing even if only as friends. That night, as Beatrice prepared for bed, she found herself thinking about Dr. Reed's grey eyes and warm smile, about the way he had asked questions as though her answers truly mattered. She felt something she hadn't felt in months, a small, tentative spark of interest in the future, a curiosity about what might come next. It wasn't love, not yet, perhaps not ever, But it was possibility, and after the darkness of the past weeks, possibility felt like dawn breaking. The concert the following Tuesday proved to be a revelation. The Viennese pianist Herr Friedrich Schumann performed a program that included several of Beethoven's most challenging sonatas, and Beatrice found herself completely absorbed in the music. During the interval, Dr. Reed asked thoughtful questions about what they had heard, and Beatrice discovered that explaining the technical aspects of the performance deepened her own appreciation. For the first time in her life, she was sharing her passion for music with someone who valued her expertise rather than merely tolerating it as a feminine accomplishment. Over the following weeks, Dr. Reed became a regular presence in Beatrice's life. He attended Agatha's salon, where his contributions to discussions on medicine and science were always illuminating. He invited Beatrice and Agatha to lectures at the Bath Literary and Scientific Institution, where Beatrice heard talks on subjects she had never been allowed to study: natural philosophy, astronomy, the new theories of electricity, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, what had begun as friendship began to shift into something deeper. Dr. Reed never pressed her, never demanded more than she was ready to give. But there were moments, a hand lingering on hers as he helped her from a carriage, a look that held warmth beyond mere friendship, a conversation that stretched late into the evening, when Beatrice felt the possibility of something she had never expected to find. Not the dutiful affection she had resigned herself to with the Duke, but genuine connection, mutual respect, and perhaps in time, love. 3 months after her arrival in Bath, Agatha announced that she had secured invitations to the season's most prestigious event, the grand charity concert at the Assembly Rooms, an evening that would draw not only Bath society, but visitors from London and beyond. The proceeds would benefit the new hospital that Dr. Reed and several other physicians were establishing for the city's poor. "It will be quite the affair," Agatha said over breakfast. "The Prince Regent himself has sent a donation, and half of London's elite will be in attendance, including, I'm told, the Duke of Winterbourne and his new Duchess." Beatrice's teacup rattled against its saucer. "Cecilia is married, then?" 3 weeks ago, apparently. A quiet ceremony, given the circumstances, but they're on their wedding tour, and Bath is one of their stops. Agatha watched her niece carefully. "We need not attend if you'd prefer to avoid them." Beatrice set down her cup with deliberate care. For 3 months she had been healing, growing, discovering who she was beyond the expectations of London society. She had learned to value her own intelligence, to speak her mind, to pursue her interests without apology. She had found friends who appreciated her for herself, and perhaps in Dr. Reed, something more. The thought of facing the Duke and Cecilia filled her with dread, but it also sparked something else, a fierce determination not to hide, not to let them see her diminished. "No," she said firmly, "we will attend. I have nothing to be ashamed of, and I will not skulk in the shadows as though I do." The night of the concert arrived with all the splendor of a Bath summer evening. The assembly rooms glowed with candlelight, and the cream of society filled the elegant spaces, their jewels glittering and their voices creating a pleasant hum of anticipation. Beatrice wore a gown of deep emerald silk that brought out the copper highlights in her auburn hair, and Agatha had lent her a necklace of pearls that had belonged to their grandmother. She looked, Agatha assured her, absolutely magnificent. Dr. Reed met them at the entrance, and the warmth in his eyes when he saw Beatrice made her heart skip. "Lady Beatrice," he said, offering his arm, "you look radiant. Though I confess I'm more interested in your thoughts on the program than your appearance. I understand they'll be performing several pieces you particularly admire." They entered the concert hall together, and Beatrice was immediately aware of the whispers that followed her. She'd been away from society for 3 months, but clearly the scandal had not been forgotten. Heads turned, fans fluttered, and behind gloved hands the gossip resumed. But this time, Beatrice held her head high, secure in the knowledge that she was no longer the woman who had fled London in disgrace. She had changed, grown stronger, and she would not be cowed by their judgment. They had just taken their seats when a stir at the entrance announced the arrival of the Duke and Duchess of Winterbourne. Beatrice forced herself to look, to face what she had been avoiding. The Duke looked much as he always had, handsome, distinguished, supremely confident. But Cecilia looked diminished. Her gown was magnificent, her jewels impressive, but there was a tightness around her mouth, a dimness in her eyes that spoke of unhappiness. She clung to the Duke's arm as though it were a lifeline, and when her gaze met Beatrice's across the room, the guilt and misery in her expression were unmistakable. The Duke, however, showed no such discomfort. He surveyed the room with his usual air of superiority, nodded to various acquaintances, and then his gaze landed on Beatrice. For a moment, surprise flickered across his features. Clearly he had not expected to see her here. Then his expression hardened into something like disdain, and he deliberately turned away, guiding Cecilia to seats on the opposite side of the room. "Insufferable man," Agatha muttered, "as though he has any right to look down on you after his behavior." Dr. Reed leaned closer to Beatrice. "Are you all right? We can leave if this is too difficult." Beatrice shook her head. "No, I'm exactly where I want to be." The concert began, and for a time, Beatrice lost herself in the music. The performers were excellent, the program well chosen, and she felt the familiar solace that music had always provided. But during the interval, as guests mingled and refreshments were served, the inevitable confrontation occurred. Beatrice was standing with Dr. Reed and Agatha, discussing the first half of the program, when the Duke of Winterbourne approached. Cecilia trailed behind him, her face pale and her eyes downcast. "Lady Agatha," the Duke said with a slight bow, "I had not realized you were in Bath, and Lady Beatrice, how unexpected to see you here." "Is it?" Beatrice replied coolly. "I have been residing with my aunt for the past 3 months. Bath society has been most welcoming." The Duke's gaze shifted to Dr. Reed, and something like contempt flickered in his eyes. "I see you found new companions. How quickly one adapts to reduced circumstances." Dr. Reed stiffened, but before he could respond, Beatrice spoke. "Dr. Reed is a physician and a scholar, Your Grace. I consider myself fortunate to count him among my friends. But then, you always did have difficulty recognizing true worth when you saw it." The Duke's jaw tightened. "Still as sharp-tongued as ever, I see. I had hoped that your time away from society might have taught you the value of a more agreeable temperament. And I had hoped that marriage might have taught you the value of kindness," Beatrice countered. "But it seems we have both been disappointed in our expectations." Cecilia finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Beatrice, please, I never meant—" "I know," Beatrice said, her tone softening slightly as she looked at her sister. "But intentions matter little when weighed against consequences, don't they?" The Duke placed a possessive hand on Cecilia's arm. "Come, my dear, we needn't subject ourselves to this unpleasantness. Lady Beatrice has made her choices, and we have made ours. I'm sure she's quite content with her new life, limited though it may be." As they turned to leave, Beatrice felt a surge of anger, unlike anything she had experienced before. For months, she had been the object of scorn and pity, had been judged and found wanting by a man who had never truly seen her. And suddenly she was done with silence, done with accepting his assessment of her worth. "Your Grace," she called out, her voice carrying across the crowded room. The Duke stopped, turning back with an expression of irritation. "I wonder," Beatrice continued, "if you still maintain your interest in rare musical manuscripts. I recall you mentioning your collection during our brief acquaintance." The Duke's expression shifted to one of wary interest. "I do. It is one of the finest private collections in England. Why do you ask?" "I was merely curious whether you had succeeded in your search for the lost Clementi Sonata, the one you told my father you would pay any price to acquire." Now she had his full attention. The Duke took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "The Sonata in F minor. No one has found it. Clementi wrote it late in his life, but the manuscript disappeared after his death. It's been lost for nearly 2 decades. Beatrice smiled, and there was something dangerous in the expression. Not lost, Your Grace, merely waiting for someone worthy of playing it. The room had gone quiet, other conversations fading as people sensed the drama unfolding. The Duke stared at Beatrice, disbelief and hunger warring in his expression. You're saying you have it? That's impossible. I've had agents searching across Europe for years. And yet, Beatrice said softly, it has been in England all along, in my possession to be precise. A gift from my grandmother, who studied with Clementi himself in her youth. She gave it to me on her deathbed, knowing I was the only one in the family with the skill to do it justice. The Duke's face had gone pale. If this is true, if you truly have the manuscript, I will pay whatever you ask for it. It's not for sale, Beatrice said, but I would be willing to play it here, tonight, if the organizers of the concert would permit an additional performance. The room erupted in excited whispers. The chairman of the concert committee, Lord Hartwell, pushed forward through the crowd. Lady Beatrice, are you serious? The lost Clementi Sonata. If you could perform it, it would be the musical event of the decade. I am quite serious, Beatrice replied, and I would be honored to contribute to such a worthy cause as the new hospital. Within minutes, arrangements were made. The second half of the program would be delayed to allow Lady Beatrice Ashford to perform the legendary Lost Sonata. As the audience returned to their seats, buzzing with anticipation, Dr. Reed took Beatrice's hand. That was either very brave or very reckless, he said quietly. Can you truly play it? I've been practicing it for 10 years, Beatrice replied. It's the most technically demanding piece I know, and the most beautiful. I've never performed it publicly because I knew that once I did, everyone would know I had been hiding my true abilities all along. But I'm done hiding, Elias. I'm done pretending to be less than I am. He squeezed her hand gently. Then show them who you truly are. Beatrice walked to the pianoforte that had been positioned at the front of the hall. The room fell silent as she settled onto the bench, her hands resting lightly on the keys. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her, curious, skeptical, eager. She could see the Duke in his seat, leaning forward with an expression of intense concentration. She could see Cecilia, tears streaming down her face. She could see Agatha beaming with pride, and Dr. Reed, his grey eyes warm with encouragement. And then she began to play. The Clementi Sonata in F minor was a masterpiece of late classical composition, bridging the gap between Mozart's elegance and Beethoven's passion. It opened with a haunting melody in the minor key, deceptively simple at first, before exploding into a cascade of complex harmonies and technically demanding passages. Beatrice's fingers flew across the keys, her years of secret practice evident in every note. She played with a passion and skill that left no doubt of her mastery, pouring into the music all the emotion she had suppressed for so long. The anger, the grief, the joy of liberation, the tentative hope for the future. The second movement was slower, more introspective, a meditation on loss and longing that brought tears to many eyes. Beatrice played it with exquisite sensitivity, each phrase perfectly shaped, each dynamic carefully controlled. This was not the playing of an accomplished amateur, but of a true artist, someone who understood the music not just technically but emotionally, spiritually. The final movement returned to the minor key, building to a triumphant conclusion that showcased every aspect of Beatrice's considerable technique: rapid scales, complex chord progressions, intricate counterpoint. As she played the final ringing chords, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Then the silence shattered into thunderous applause. People rose to their feet, calling out their approval, demanding an encore. Beatrice stood and curtsied, her heart pounding, her hands trembling with the aftermath of such an intense performance. She had done it. She had revealed herself completely, and instead of scorn, she had received acclaim. "Doctor," Reed was the first to reach her as she stepped away from the pianoforte, and the look in his eyes made her breath catch. "That was extraordinary," he said. "You are extraordinary." Before she could respond, Lord Hartwell was there, pumping her hand enthusiastically. "Lady Beatrice, that was magnificent, simply magnificent. We must have you perform again, perhaps a full concert of your own." Others crowded around, offering congratulations and praise. But through the throng, Beatrice saw the Duke of Winterbourne standing alone, his face a mask of shock and something that might have been regret. Cecilia had disappeared, perhaps unable to bear witnessing her sister's triumph. Finally, the Duke made his way to where Beatrice stood. "I had no idea," he said quietly. "All those months we were engaged, and I never knew you could play like that." "You never asked," Beatrice replied. "You never wanted to know. You wanted a decorative duchess, not a woman with her own talents and passions." "I was a fool," the Duke admitted, and for the first time she heard genuine emotion in his voice. "I threw away something precious because I was too blind to see its value." "Yes," Beatrice agreed, "you did, but in doing so, you gave me the freedom to become who I was always meant to be. So perhaps I should thank you, Your Grace." She turned away from him then, back to where Dr. Reed and Agatha waited, back to the life she was building for herself. As she took Dr. Reed's offered arm and allowed him to guide her through the crowd, she felt lighter than she had in years. The cage was broken, the chains severed, and she was finally, truly free. Later that evening, as they stood on the terrace of the assembly rooms, looking out over the lights of Bath, Dr. Reed turned to Beatrice with an expression of nervous determination. "Lady Beatrice, Beatrice, I know this may be too soon, and I know you have no reason to trust in marriage after what you've experienced. But I must speak, or I shall regret my silence forever." Beatrice's heart began to race. "Elias, I love you," he said simply. "I love your intelligence, your passion, your courage. I love the way you speak about music, the way you challenge ideas, the way you've rebuilt yourself from the ashes of scandal. I have no title, no great fortune, only my profession and my devotion. But if you could ever consider accepting me, I would spend my life ensuring that you never again have to hide who you are." Beatrice looked at this man who had seen her at her lowest, and had offered not pity but respect, who had valued her mind as much as her beauty, who had encouraged her to be fully herself. She thought of the Duke, who had wanted to diminish her, and of Elias, who wanted to celebrate her. The choice was not difficult. "Yes," she said, her voice steady and sure. "Yes, Elias, I will marry you." His smile was radiant as he took her hands in his. "You've made me the happiest of men. We'll have a true partnership, Beatrice. Your music, my medicine, our shared love of learning and discovery. We'll build a life together that honors both of us." As he drew her into his arms for their first kiss, Beatrice felt the final pieces of her old life fall away. She was no longer Lady Beatrice Ashford, the rejected bride, the scandal of London society. She was simply Beatrice, a woman who had found her voice, her passion, and her future. And it was more than she had ever dared to dream. The announcement of Beatrice's engagement to Dr. Elias Reed sent fresh ripples through society, though these were of a very different character than the scandal that had preceded them. In Bath, where Beatrice had spent the past months establishing herself as a woman of genuine talent and intelligence, the news was greeted with delight. Agatha's salon erupted in celebration, and invitations poured in from families eager to host the couple. The story of Lady Beatrice's triumphant performance of the lost Clementi Sonata had spread throughout England, transforming her from an object of pity into a figure of fascination and respect. In London, however, the reaction was more complex. The Ton was forced to reassess its judgment of Lady Beatrice Ashford. She had not, as they had assumed, retreated into obscurity and shame. Instead, she had emerged stronger, more accomplished, and more interesting than before. The fact that she was marrying a mere physician, a man without title or significant fortune, was shocking, but it also carried a romantic appeal that captured imaginations. Here was a woman who had chosen love and partnership over status and wealth, who had valued character over consequence. The Duke and Duchess of Winterbourne cut short their wedding tour and returned to London, where they found themselves the subject of less flattering gossip. Whispers circulated about the Duchess's unhappiness, about the Duke's cold treatment of his young wife, about the contrast between their loveless alliance and Beatrice's genuine affection for Dr. Reed. Society, always fickle, began to view the Duke's rejection of Beatrice not as a fortunate escape for him, but as a catastrophic error in judgment. One morning, about 2 weeks after the engagement announcement, Beatrice received an unexpected visitor. She was in Agatha's music room practicing a new piece when the butler announced that the Duchess of Winterbourne had called and was requesting an audience. Beatrice's first instinct was to refuse, but something in the butler's expression, a mixture of pity and concern, made her reconsider. "Show her in," she said quietly, rising from the pianoforte. Cecilia entered the room hesitantly, as though afraid of the reception she might receive. She wore a walking dress of pale lavender, exquisitely tailored, but somehow emphasizing her fragility rather than her beauty. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and she had lost weight, her cheekbones too prominent in her delicate face. "Beatrice," she said, her voice trembling, "thank you for seeing me. I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure I would either," Beatrice admitted. "What do you want, Cecilia?" Cecilia twisted her hands together, a gesture Beatrice remembered from their childhood when her sister was nervous or upset. "I came to apologize. Properly, I mean. Not the tearful, inadequate words I spoke at the ball, but a real apology. What I did was unforgivable. I allowed myself to be flattered by his attention, to be seduced by the idea of being a duchess. I told myself that you didn't really want to marry him anyway, that I was somehow doing you a favor, but the truth is, I was selfish and weak, and I betrayed you." Beatrice studied her sister carefully. "And now? Are you happy, Cecilia? Was it worth it?" Tears spilled down Cecilia's cheeks. "No, I'm miserable. He's not the man I thought he was, Beatrice. He's cold and controlling and—" She stopped, seeming to catch herself. "But that's not why I came. I didn't come to complain about my choices or to seek your pity. I came because I needed you to know how sorry I am and how much I admire what you've done. You've built a new life for yourself, found genuine happiness. You've shown more courage than I ever could." Beatrice felt her anger, which she had nursed for months, begin to soften. Cecilia had made a terrible mistake, but she was paying for it, and she was still Beatrice's sister. "I won't say that what you did was acceptable," Beatrice said slowly. "It wasn't. You hurt me deeply, and that pain doesn't simply disappear. But I also understand that you were young and foolish, and that the Duke manipulated both of us. I'm not ready to forget what happened, but perhaps in time I can forgive." Cecilia nodded, wiping at her tears. "That's more than I deserve. I hope you'll be happy with Dr. Reed. From what I've heard, he's a good man who truly values you." "He is," Beatrice agreed. "He sees me, Cecilia, not as an ornament or a duty, but as a person with thoughts and feelings and talents worth celebrating. That's all I ever wanted." Sadis, after Cecilia left, Beatrice stood at the window for a long time, watching the streets of Bath and thinking about forgiveness, about the different paths that she and her sister had chosen, about the price of ambition and the value of authenticity. She felt a deep sadness for Cecilia, trapped in a marriage that brought her no joy, but she also felt profound gratitude for her own escape. The Duke had rejected her, but in doing so, he had given her the greatest gift imaginable, the freedom to choose her own future. The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of activity. Unlike her previous engagement, which had been orchestrated entirely by others, Beatrice took an active role in planning this ceremony. She chose a simple gown of cream silk, elegant but not ostentatious. She selected music for the service herself, including a piece she had composed specifically for the occasion. She insisted that the guest list include not just family, but the friends she had made in Bath. the writers, artists, scientists, and thinkers who had welcomed her into their circle. Dr. Reed's family travelled from Yorkshire for the wedding, his widowed mother, his two younger sisters, and his brother, who managed the family's modest estate. They were warm and welcoming, delighted that Elias had found such an accomplished and intelligent wife. Mrs. Reed embraced Beatrice with genuine affection, whispering, "I can see why my son loves you. You have a strength in you that will serve you both well." Beatrice's own family arrived the day before the wedding. Her father was stiff and formal, still uncomfortable with his daughter's choice to marry so far beneath her station. Her mother wept copiously, though whether from joy or disappointment Beatrice couldn't tell. But Agatha was there, beaming with pride, and that was enough. The night before the wedding, as Beatrice sat in her room at Agatha's house, there was a soft knock at the door. She opened it to find her father standing in the hallway, looking older and more uncertain than she had ever seen him. "May I come in?" he asked quietly. Beatrice stepped aside, allowing him to enter. They stood in awkward silence for a moment before Lord Ashford spoke. "I came to apologize," he said. "I pushed you toward a marriage that would have made you miserable because I was thinking only of the family's financial security and social position. I didn't consider your happiness, your desires, your remarkable talents. I treated you as a commodity rather than as my daughter, and for that I am deeply sorry." Beatrice felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you, Father. That means more than you know. Dr. Reed is a good man," Lord Ashford continued. "I've made inquiries. He's respected in his profession, admired for his dedication to his patients, particularly the poor. He won't be able to give you the life of luxury that the Duke could have provided, but I believe he will give you something far more valuable: respect, partnership, and genuine affection." "He will," Beatrice agreed. "And I will be happy, Father, truly happy." Lord Ashford embraced her then, and Beatrice felt a weight she hadn't known she was carrying finally lift from her shoulders. Her father's approval didn't change her decision, but it eased something in her heart, a lingering hurt that she hadn't fully acknowledged until this moment. The wedding took place on a brilliant September morning in Bath Abbey, with sunlight streaming through the ancient stained-glass windows and filling the space with coloured light. Beatrice walked down the aisle on her father's arm, but her eyes were fixed on Elias, who stood at the altar with an expression of such love and joy that it took her breath away. The ceremony was simple but beautiful. They exchanged vows they had written themselves, promising not just to love and honour, but to support each other's ambitions, to celebrate each other's achievements, to build a life based on mutual respect and genuine partnership. When Elias slipped the ring onto her finger, Beatrice felt a sense of rightness, of coming home to herself that she had never experienced before. At the wedding breakfast that followed, Agatha rose to offer a toast. "To Beatrice and Elias," she said, raising her glass. "May your marriage be a true partnership of equals. May you never stop challenging and inspiring each other. And may you always remember that the greatest love is that which allows both partners to be fully themselves." As the guests raised their glasses and called out their approval, Beatrice looked around the room at the people who had supported her through the darkest period of her life and who now celebrated her happiness. She saw Elias's mother wiping away happy tears, saw her father smiling with what looked like genuine pleasure, saw the friends from Agatha's salon beaming at her, and she felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought her here. Later, as she and Elias prepared to depart for their wedding trip, a tour of the Lake District where they planned to walk, read, and simply enjoy each other's company, Beatrice took a moment to stand alone in the abbey, looking up at the soaring arches and the light filtering through the windows. She thought about the woman she had been 6 months ago, trapped in a life she hadn't chosen, resigned to a future that would have slowly suffocated her spirit. She thought about the humiliation of that terrible night, the pain of rejection, the shame of public scandal, and she realized that all of it, Every moment of suffering, every tear shed, every whispered insult endured had been necessary to bring her to this moment. She had been broken down so that she could be rebuilt, stronger and truer than before. "Ready?" Elias asked, appearing beside her and offering his hand. Beatrice took it, lacing her fingers through his. "Yes," she said, "I'm ready." As they walked out of the abbey together into the bright September sunshine, Beatrice felt the future stretching before her, full of possibility and promise. She was no longer Lady Beatrice Ashford, the Earl's daughter who had been found wanting. She was Mrs. Elias Reed, a woman who had chosen her own path and claimed her own destiny, and she had never been more certain that she was exactly where she was meant to be. 8 months after her wedding, Beatrice stood in the drawing room of the comfortable townhouse she and Elias had purchased in Bath, putting the finishing touches on preparations for the evening's salon. The room was arranged to accommodate both conversation and music, with chairs grouped in intimate clusters and the pianoforte positioned where it could be heard throughout the space. Fresh flowers from the garden filled vases on every surface, and the table was laden with refreshments that their housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, had spent the day preparing. Life as Mrs. Reed had exceeded even Beatrice's hopeful expectations. The house they had chosen was modest by aristocratic standards, but perfect for their needs, large enough to entertain, with a dedicated music room for Beatrice's practice and a study for Elias's medical research, but intimate enough to feel like a true home rather than a showplace. They had furnished it with care, choosing pieces for comfort and beauty rather than ostentation, filling the shelves with books they both loved, hanging artwork that spoke to them rather than impressed visitors. Beatrice's days had fallen into a rhythm that brought her deep satisfaction. Her mornings were dedicated to music, practice, composition, and increasingly teaching. Word of her talent had spread, and she now had a small but select group of students, young women whose families valued genuine musical education over mere accomplishment. She taught them not just technique, but interpretation, not just to play correctly, but to play with passion and understanding. Watching her students discover their own musical voices gave Beatrice a sense of purpose she had never found in the endless social obligations of her previous life. Her afternoons were often spent at the hospital that Elias and his colleagues had established for Bath's poor. Beatrice had discovered that she had a gift for administration and fundraising, and she had taken on the role of organizing charity concerts and soliciting donations from wealthy patrons. She used her connections to London society, connections that had been renewed once her marriage and musical talent had made her interesting rather than scandalous, to secure support for the hospital's expansion. It was deeply satisfying work, using her social skills and her family name for a purpose that actually mattered. Evenings were reserved for the salon that she and Agatha now hosted jointly, alternating between their two homes. These gatherings had become the intellectual heart of Bath society, drawing not just local residents, but visitors from across England who wanted to participate in the lively discussions of literature, science, philosophy, and art. Beatrice had discovered that she loved facilitating these conversations, drawing out shy participants, challenging assumptions, creating an atmosphere where ideas could be freely exchanged, regardless of the speaker's sex or social status. And through it all, there was Elias. Her husband had proven to be everything she had hoped and more, a true partner who celebrated her achievements as enthusiastically as his own, who consulted her on his medical research and listened seriously to her suggestions, who never once suggested that her interests were trivial or her ambitions inappropriate. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, debated philosophy over breakfast, read aloud to each other in the evenings. Their physical relationship, which Beatrice had approached with some trepidation, given her lack of experience, had blossomed into something beautiful and joyful, a source of pleasure and connection that deepened their bond. On this particular evening, as guests began to arrive for the salon, Beatrice felt a flutter of nervous excitement. Tonight's gathering was special. She would be premiering a new composition, a piano sonata she had been working on for months. It was her most ambitious work yet, a piece that drew on everything she had learned from the masters while finding her own distinctive voice. She had titled it Sonata in E Major, Liberation, and it told the story of her own journey from constraint to freedom. Elias was the first to arrive, having come directly from the hospital. He kissed her cheek and whispered, "Are you nervous about tonight?" "Terrified," Beatrice admitted. "This piece is so personal. I'm not sure I'm ready to share it." "You're ready," he assured her, "and they will love it just as I do." Guests continued to arrive. Agatha, of course, along with the regular salon attendees. There were writers and poets, scientists and physicians, artists and musicians. There was Lady Hartwell, who had become a good friend and whose husband had been instrumental in securing funding for the hospital. There was Miss Caroline Winters, a young novelist whose first book had caused quite a stir with its frank portrayal of women's limited options. There was Professor Blackwood from the university, whose lectures on natural philosophy Beatrice had attended with great interest. And there, to Beatrice's surprise, was her sister Cecilia. Beatrice hadn't seen Cecilia since that tearful visit months ago. She knew from family letters that her sister's marriage remained unhappy, that the Duke continued to be cold and controlling, that Cecilia had grown increasingly isolated in her grand London mansion. But here she was, dressed in a travelling costume of dark blue, looking thin and tired, but with a spark of determination in her eyes that Beatrice hadn't seen before. "Cecilia," Beatrice said, crossing the room to greet her sister, "I didn't know you were coming to Bath." "I didn't tell anyone," Cecilia admitted. I needed to get away, and I remembered how happy you seemed here. I hope you don't mind my coming uninvited." "Of course not," Beatrice said, embracing her sister. "You're always welcome here." As the evening progressed, Beatrice watched Cecilia gradually relax, drawn into conversations about books and ideas, laughing at witty observations, contributing her own thoughts with increasing confidence. This was a side of her sister that Beatrice had rarely seen, intelligent, engaged, interested in the world beyond ballrooms and fashion. It made her wonder how much of Cecilia's previous persona had been performance, how much she too had been hiding her true self to meet society's expectations. Finally, the moment arrived for Beatrice to perform her new composition. The room fell silent as she took her seat at the pianoforte, her hands resting lightly on the keys. She took a deep breath, feeling the familiar pre-performance nerves, but also a sense of rightness. This was her truth, her story, and she was ready to share it. The sonata began quietly, with a simple melody in the major key that gradually became more complex, more constrained, as minor harmonies crept in. This was the first movement, representing her life before the scandal, beautiful on the surface, but increasingly suffocating. The second movement was turbulent and dramatic, full of dissonant chords and crashing crescendos, depicting the humiliation and pain of rejection. But then came the third movement, where the music began to open up, to breathe, as hope and possibility emerged. And the final movement was pure joy, a celebration of freedom, of authentic self-expression, of love freely given and received. As Beatrice played the final triumphant chords, she looked up to find tears streaming down many faces. Agatha was openly weeping. Elias's eyes were bright with emotion, and even the usually reserved Professor Blackwood was wiping at his eyes. But it was Cecilia's expression that struck Beatrice most deeply. Her sister looked transformed, as though she had just witnessed something that changed her understanding of what was possible. The applause was thunderous, but Beatrice barely heard it. She rose from the pianoforte and found herself immediately surrounded by well-wishers, all eager to express their admiration and appreciation. But she made her way through the crowd to where Cecilia stood, still looking dazed. "That was your story," Cecilia said quietly. "Everything you went through, everything you overcame. It was beautiful, Beatrice, and it made me realize something." "What's that?" Beatrice asked. That I've been living the life you escaped. I'm trapped in the cage you broke free from, and I've been too afraid to even try to open the door." Cecilia's voice grew stronger, more determined. "But watching you tonight, seeing what you've built for yourself, the happiness you've found, it's shown me that there are other ways to live. I don't have to accept misery as my fate." Beatrice took her sister's hands. "What are you saying, Cecilia?" "I'm saying that I'm going to leave him, the Duke. I'm going to end my marriage and face whatever scandal comes from it, because I'd rather be ruined and free than respectable and miserable." Beatrice felt a surge of concern. "Cecilia, that's a serious decision. The consequences will be severe, I know. But you survived scandal, and you're happier than you've ever been. Maybe I can too." Cecilia squeezed Beatrice's hands. "Will you help me? Will you let me stay here in Bath while I figure out my next steps?" Beatrice didn't hesitate. "Of course. You're my sister. Whatever you need." In the weeks that followed, Cecilia did indeed leave the Duke of Winterbourne, creating a scandal that eclipsed even Beatrice's previous disgrace. The Duke was furious, threatening legal action and social ruin. London society was divided. Some condemned Cecilia for abandoning her marriage vows. Others quietly admired her courage. But in Bath, surrounded by Beatrice and Elias's supportive circle, Cecilia began to heal and to discover who she was, beyond the roles others had assigned her. One afternoon, about a month after Cecilia's arrival, Beatrice received a letter that made her laugh aloud. It was from Lady Pemberton, the hostess of that fateful musical where the Duke had first dismissed Beatrice's musical taste. "My dear Mrs. Reed," the letter read, "I write to inform you that the Duke of Winterbourne called upon me yesterday, inquiring whether I knew the whereabouts of the Clementi manuscript. He offered a quite substantial sum for it, claiming it was of great historical importance. I took great pleasure in informing him that such matters were entirely your concern, not mine, and that given his treatment of you, he could hardly expect your cooperation. His expression was most gratifying. I thought you might enjoy knowing that your triumph continues to vex him." Beatrice shared the letter with Elias over dinner that evening, and they both laughed at the Duke's continued obsession with the manuscript. "Will you ever publish it?" Elias asked. "Allow other musicians to perform it?" "Perhaps," Beatrice said thoughtfully. "But not yet. For now it's mine. A symbol of everything I kept hidden for so long and everything I've reclaimed. When I'm ready to share it with the world, I will. But on my terms, not because someone like the Duke demands it." As summer turned to autumn and then to winter, Beatrice's life continued to flourish. Her reputation as both a performer and a composer grew, and she received invitations to perform in London, Edinburgh, and even Paris. She and Elias travelled together when possible, combining his medical conferences with her concerts, exploring new cities and ideas together. When they were apart, they wrote long letters full of observations and affection, counting the days until they would be reunited. Cecilia, meanwhile, had begun to find her own path. She discovered a talent for painting and began taking lessons from a local artist. She also became involved in the hospital's work, particularly in establishing a program to teach poor women basic nursing skills so they could support themselves. The scandal of her separation from the Duke gradually faded, replaced by respect for the work she was doing and the courage she had shown in choosing authenticity over status. One spring morning, exactly a year after her wedding, Beatrice woke to find Elias already awake, watching her with an expression of such tenderness that it made her heart skip. "What is it?" she asked, smiling. "I was just thinking about how lucky I am," he said, "to have found you, to share this life with you. You've made me happier than I ever imagined possible." "The feeling is entirely mutual," Beatrice assured him, reaching up to touch his face. "You gave me the freedom to be fully myself, Elias. That's the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." Later that day, as Beatrice sat at her pianoforte working on a new composition, she paused to look around the music room. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the shelves of music, the comfortable chairs where Elias often sat to listen to her practice, the flowers she had arranged that morning. This room, this house, this life. It was all so far from what she had once thought her future would hold, and it was infinitely better. She thought about the Duke of Winterbourne, trapped in his loveless marriage, still searching for the manuscript that represented everything he had failed to appreciate when it was within his grasp. She thought about the woman she had been a year ago, walking down the aisle toward a future that would have slowly destroyed her spirit, and she felt nothing but gratitude for the humiliation that had set her free. Beatrice returned to her composition, her fingers finding the melody that had been eluding her all morning. The music flowed from her, joyful and complex, technically demanding but emotionally resonant. It was her voice, authentic and uncompromised, and she would never silence it again. She had bloomed where she was planted, but more than that, she had chosen her own garden, tended it with care, and created something beautiful from the ashes of her old life. And as the music filled the room and spilled out through the open windows into the spring air, Beatrice smiled. She was exactly where she was meant to be, living exactly the life she was meant to live. The cage was broken, the chains severed, and she was finally, completely, gloriously free. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments from which part of the world you're listening. I want to know how far this tale has traveled.